My grandfather never allowed radios in the house. He had a very good reason. A reason that I am now all too familiar with. I'm getting ahead of myself. The above statement was the beginning of a suicide note that I read last month during a welfare check. After the harrowing last month that I've had, that note has had an increasingly profound effect on my psyche. I don't know where else to turn, so I'll be posting the full note, with minor redactions here. Before I do so, some context. The author of the letter, an elderly man with an apparent family history of suicide, had not been seen in town for a while. This prompted concerned town residents to request the welfare check for the man, who apparently had no family. Our check resulted in the discovery of a suicide, and the accompanying note. My grandfather never allowed radios in the house. He had a very good reason, a reason that I am now all too familiar with. It is solely the fault of this reason for what I am about to do. To whoever finds this, I am sorry for making you see this scene. Accordingly, I will state the facts and write it all down before I take my own life tonight. Just as my mother, grandfather, his father, and his father, and his father all did before me, on this December 4th of 2019. First, let me assure you that I'm neither crazy nor demented. I know that it'll be tempting to write me off as a senile old man, so allow me to assuage those concerns. My name is redacted. I am 83 years old, and I was born on January 6th, 1936. You will find these basic facts along with my grim family history to be true and verifiable. There is no one who will mourn me. I have no family. I am long predeceased by my mother, by nearly 80 years, and my grandfather by over 60 years. This is the best of two terrible options. Now then, allow me to begin. I never knew my father. He disappeared before I was born. I barely remember my mother either. She died in the summer of 1942, when I was just 6 years old. It wasn't until I was older that I learned that she had taken her own life. I lived with my grandfather after that. He was good to me and we got along well. There is a certain sadness to him, likely that of a parent who had lost a child, which I cannot relate to, but also the sadness of a man aware of his impending and inevitable doom, which I can most certainly relate to, for I felt it myself for the last 20 years. This impending doom is where this seemingly odd rule came in. An absolute refusal to allow radios, record players, or any kind of music whatsoever in the house. He was unwavering with this. I often questioned him about it. He never said much about it, other than the fact that he needed to know when the music was there. He couldn't risk confusing it with music from a radio or a similar item, he said. Weird, I know, but knowing what I know now, I wish I hadn't given him such a hard time. At that point, I had never heard the purported phantom music, but I knew when he had heard them. He refused to sleep when he heard music. Even as he grew older, past his 70th birthday and close to 80, he continued to have many sleepless nights. It was beginning to take a toll on him, and I was worried. The sleepless nights were becoming more and more frequent, and he was exhausted nearly every day. Yet he still refused to sleep when he heard music. He predicted that he would soon no longer be able to make it through an entire night, and he was right. I still remember that fateful night clear as day. It was in the spring of 1957, and although I was now an adult, I still lived with him to provide assistance. On that night, his eyes grew wide and he began desperately shaking his head. "No, no, no," he said over and over again. I knew without asking that he had heard those phantom sounds. "Not tonight. I'm too tired." He was almost crying. It pained me to see him so distraught, and I offered to stay up with him all night, but he declined. "No," he said with a sad and heavy voice. "It's my time, I think." That caught me off guard. My grandfather was 77, but in fairly good health still. Noticing my reaction, he assured me all was well before retiring to his study. I was uneasy and anxious, but I was able to brush it off and go to sleep. At least, I was able to sleep until a bang woke me up in the middle of the night. A loud bang coming from my grandfather's room. I steeled myself, expecting the worst, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. My beloved grandfather slumped over his desk with a pistol in his right hand. His blood and brain matter on the desk remains the worst thing that I have ever seen. I was so strongly affected that it took me several minutes to see that he left me a suicide note on the desk. It read, author's name. "I am sorry you have to see this. Truly I am. But I couldn't let them get to me. I came closer to finding the truth than any of my forefathers before me, but I don't know everything. I do not know if allowing them to get me would have ended this curse and spared you a life of torment. If it would have, I am sorry that my strength failed you. In any event, they will be coming for you now. Protect yourself, and watch out for the music." I don't know how long I stared dumbly at that note afterwards. Everything was a blur for the next few days. Calling the police, the funeral, the burial. I was in shock for a few days. In fact, I'm basically blank about the next few months. At least until the night of July 6th, 1957. About 3 months had passed, and I now lived in my grandfather's house alone. I had my whole life, in fact, and had yet to modernize it. There were still no radios, record players, or then the cutting-edge TV. And yet despite this, I heard the unmistakable sounds of music that night. The sound of a violin and a few piano keys. Truly beautiful music. It would have been soothing if not for the connotation of it. I brushed it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination and a grief. I drifted off to sleep without worry. Oh, how wrong I was. I woke up in a room that was not mine, and for that matter, in a body that was not mine, at least not my current one. I was in a small cell with a barred door, laying on a cot. 2 stone-faced guards stood outside, watching me and unblinking. My cell was one of many in a rotunda, but mine was the only one occupied. In the middle of the rotunda was a desk with a tall, slim old man in a suit sitting behind it. "Ah, you're awake," the man said calmly. Before I could respond, he continued. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Warden Kilgore." "Warden? Is this a..." I began. "Silence, prisoner," one of the guards boomed. "Yes, this is a prison of sorts," Kilgore answered. "A realm of imprisonment for the human mind. A place of retribution for the sins of your family." I meant to ask what the hell he was talking about, but he continued before I could. "Unfortunately, you are not in your form for retribution." I looked down at my body and I gasped. I was middle-aged and I had a sizable paunch. "What the..." I started. "We'll have to settle for something lesser and then say goodbye for now," Kilgore said, ignoring my confusion. Apparently something lesser entailed having the shit whipped out of you by those two brute guards. I hated to think what retribution was if the whipping was something lesser. I was whipped until I lost consciousness, after which I woke in my own home with a start. My body was young and thin again. My back had no traces of the brutal lashing. I sighed in relief. It had all been a terrible nightmare. How wrong I was. How wrong I would be proven. Although that first experience would later prove to be a catalyst for what was to be my life, nothing terribly significant happened for a while afterwards. Basically, life went on with only a minor hitch here and there. There was one notable incident in 1959, when I mysteriously lost a tooth. Yep, you read that right. No pain, no dental problems, no trace. I went to bed. I did not hear the music that night, and I woke up with it gone. It was as if I had lost it years ago. There was no pain, just a gap where it had been the night before. As troubling as that was, my life was otherwise unperturbed. Life went on for years without hearing that accursed music, and without any dreams involving that bastard Kilgore. I moved on and life was good. For a few years, I had some semblance of a normal life. I was truly convinced that my first encounter had just been a dream, and the music, a grief-induced auditory hallucination. And for the vanished tooth, I pretended that it didn't happen. I modernized my new home as well during this time. I bought a radio and even a television, which was cutting edge back then. And best of all, I met that special someone. Name redacted was the best thing to ever happen to me, and I would have been the worst thing to ever happen to her, had she stayed. We were married in the summer of 1963, and we're talking about having a child, starting a family together, the American dream, the real deal. I know what you're thinking. Person with the misfortune of discovering this note. Why in God's name would I knowingly have a child with this hereditary curse? Well, I hadn't really experienced the curse yet. I had brushed off my one encounter as nothing but a dream. But reality soon came crashing down on my hopes and dreams. It was only a couple of nights after our wedding when I heard a familiar musical sound as I laid in bed. Despite not having heard it in 6 years, I immediately recognized it. But I didn't want the love of my life to think that I was nuts, and so I went to sleep anyway. I awoke in the same cell from my first encounter. The guard stood silently as ever, unchanged and unaged. Kilgore too looked the same. You are younger than your current state, yes? He asked plainly. I don't know, I said truthfully. I was 27 at the time, and I seemed to be in my 20s, as opposed to middle-aged, this time in the realm. You are 23 in this current state, not in the proper state for retribution, Kilgore said without a hint of emotion. No matter. There is something else that I must address. Kilgore continued before I could say anything. You are 27 years old now, and you still have yet to have a child. What business of yours is that? I snapped, losing my patience with this vague tormentor of mine. The guards angrily advanced towards my cell, but Kilgore stopped them with a dry chuckle. It is every business of mine. I'm sure by now you have realized this runs in your family, Kilgore stated. My grandfather, I began. This dates back to your great-great-great-grandfather, Kilgore interrupted. It is he who wronged me. It is he who took the easy way out instead of facing the music, forcing me to go down the family line. It is his sins that must be answered for. I simply stared. You are currently the last of your line. Fight before I have escaped from the sins of your family. I will pay a terrible price if I fail. And fail I shall if you escape without having a child. A child is my insurance." Kilgore finished. "I'll never have a child, and you will fail. Screw you." I lost my temper completely. Kilgore merely laughed. "Your grandfather was stubborn too. At first." Kilgore grinned. "You will have a child, or I will subject you to tenfold what your ancestors experienced. It's time for you to go back. But first, some discipline is in order for your insolence, and for your failure to provide me with a successor." I was expecting the whip again. I was wrong. Instead, those two bastard guards ripped out one of my teeth, the same one that had vanished in 1959, when I was 23. I jolted awake in bed, causing my wife to stir but not wake up next to me. I stared at her sleeping form sadly, knowing that she now represented a life that I could never have. I was never the same after that night. I was sad and withdrawn. My wife was patient with me and understood that I was hesitant to have children. No, not hesitant. Couldn't, wouldn't have children. How could those before me have been so selfish? Or maybe they tried but broke under duress. I nearly broke over the next 5 years of my increasingly rocky and uncommunicating marriage. The music became an almost weekly occurrence. I appeared in various states and ages in that realm, never right for retribution. I was subjected to extreme temperatures, stress positions, beatings, waterboarding, and plenty more that I would rather not name. I stood strong and I didn't have children, but I was still a wreck, a withdrawn and depressed wreck. I tried my best to communicate with my wife, but what could I have told her? She would have never believed the truth. Honestly, it says a lot for her that she stayed as long as she did. She sadly and regretfully asked to divorce in 1968, and I didn't fight it. She deserved better. She deserved a real life, and this curse wouldn't allow it. We had no hard feelings. I heard years later that she remarried and had 2 children. It's better that way. Those children are a part of a normal family, free from this curse. The encounters, while horrible, became mundane. I had many sleepless nights, but sometimes I had to sleep. Truth be told, I don't consider any of the encounters in the next decade after my divorce to be noteworthy. Until I had one of the most profoundly notable ones, one that has stayed with me ever since. I had been too tired to stay awake after hearing that accursed music, and frightfully fell asleep. When I awoke in that damn prison, I found for the first time that there was another prisoner with me. In the cell next to mine, a familiar face looked at me with great sadness. I truly couldn't believe who I was making eye contact with. I was looking at the face I had not seen in a very long time. In fact, I barely had any real memory of the face. I had, however, seen that face countless times in my family photographs. Staring at me from the cell next door was my long-deceased mother. I'll admit that I didn't know much about her, considering I had only been 6 when she had died. I knew that she was born in 1905. I knew that she took her own life in 1942, at the age of just 37. I also knew that she was a strong and independent woman ahead of her time. In 1935, she was 30 years old and never married with no children. Quite unusual for the time. I knew from my grandfather that she had vowed to never have children, that she would be the last and end the curse. And she kept her resolve until a strange turn of events happened. In April 1935, she simply vanished one night without a trace. No explanation, no clues. Nothing. Just as magically as she had disappeared, she suddenly reappeared 9 months later, in January 1936, with a newborn son. Me. According to my grandfather, she was never the same after that. She was a sad shell of her former self. She told everyone that she had foolishly ran off with a handsome charmer of a man who had abandoned her after she gave birth. She had given into a foolish flight of fancy and brought a bastard into the family. She was certainly the subject of gossip and ridicule from townsfolk. That surely must have exacerbated the trauma that she was already feeling. My grandfather knew better though. He knew that she was a strong person with a good head on her shoulders. He knew that she wouldn't fall for the honeyed words of some con man. He suspected that something far more evil and sinister had occurred. He would never tell me what exactly he thought had happened, but I was certainly beginning to get an idea of what had happened to the tortured woman who had birthed me, the woman who I was seeing in this realm right now. Of course, it must be said that since I was intersecting with my mother, I was currently in a form of myself younger than when I was 6, but I digress. "Mom," I said incredulously. She was struggling not to sob as she spoke. "No, not you too." "Yes," I said sadly. "How old are you really right now?" she asked. "I'm 43. It's 1979. They've been after me for 22 years now." "Do you?" she started to ask, trembling with dread. "No children. Badly as I wanted them, I know that I can't," I assured her, somehow sensing her question. She sobbed again. "I'm so sorry," she cried. I knew what she was apologizing for, but I tried to reassure her. "No, I need to apologize. This will probably be our only chance to have a heart-to-heart talk," she insisted. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to have children," she continued. "I tried to resist. I tried as hard as I could." "He tried to make you have a child too, right?" she asked. I nodded. "It's much easier to force a woman to have a child against her will than it is to force a man," she stated. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. "Surely, you know that I disappeared for 9 months," she said. I protested vehemently, outraged at this explicit revelation. "I'm so sorry," she finished, sobbing profusely. "It's not your fault. I don't blame you. You were amazing in the years that you lived." I just wanted her to feel remotely better. "You don't know how horrible it was. I know you've endured a lot, but they've violated me in ways you or your grandfather has never feared," she said. "Please don't say anything else about that." I was beginning to break down, knowing just what my mother had endured at this monster's hands. "I will be the last," I assured her. "I'm so proud of you," she said as we touched hands through the bars. Just then, a pair of doors opened and Kilgore entered the rotunda. Well, if it isn't a 12 for tonight," he grinned. "One of my captives and the product of our laborious act of love." "You stay away from my son, you son of a bitch," my mother screamed. I would have rather taken the brunt, as I forgot I was in a small body. I still had all the memories and capacities of my adult self. "You just never learn, do you?" Kilgore chided her. "Guards, it's time to find some more unconventional discipline." "What about him?" One of the guards pointed at me. "Send him back. He's not in a good form for much of anything," Kilgore stated. I awoke with a start and a special sense of revulsion. This could not have been true. What I heard, I couldn't be the product of forceful relations between my mother and that evil tormentor. I had to try to get to the bottom of all this. I had to uncover my family history. Luckily, my grandfather had done a lot of genealogical research already, so I had a good head start. Especially with the man who had started it all, my great-great-great-grandfather. By all accounts, he was a mean son of a bitch. He was born in 1809, dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in 1857, shortly after his 48th birthday, and mourned by no one. Apparently, he had begun suffering from some sort of mental illness in the mid-1840s. Almost certainly the onset of the curse and not actually a mental illness, which was the same time he had been suspected in the disappearance of 3 people: his wife, father-in-law, and brother-in-law. He apparently confessed to having killed them in his suicide note, divulging all of these sordid details. But perhaps the most eye-catching part of all this was the surname of his 2 male victims, and the maiden name of his wife: Kilgore. If I wanted any chance of getting to the bottom of this, and maybe somehow saving myself, I was going to have to do some digging on this murder, and on just who this Kilgore was. Researching my family's history led to revulsion, confusion, and more questions than answers. Fortunately, I did not have to expend much energy due to the extensive research my grandfather had done. It may sound crazy, I was still going through his things over 20 years after his death, but he was a hoarder with troves of historical documents and books. But I'm getting off topic. I'll start at the beginning, with the monster that started it all: my great-great-great-grandfather. As I noted, he was an all-around terrible person. So terrible, in fact, that he was suspected of being behind a disappearance that was rightly presumed to be a triple murder. In 1844, the Kilgore homestead burned to the ground. Its 3 occupants, 56-year-old Obadiah Kilgore, his son Charles, and daughter Elizabeth, they were nowhere to be found. Elizabeth had recently fled from a terrifying and abusive marriage with my great-great-great-grandfather. He was never a good partner, but became exceedingly cruel when it became apparent that his wife was barren. After more than a decade of abuse, she fled after a particularly harrowing incident. Of course, this made many suspect that my great-great-great-grandfather had had a hand in the fire and the disappearance, but there is no actual evidence. But shortly after this tragedy, my cursed ancestor began to deteriorate mentally and physically. He reported auditory hallucinations, music, refused to sleep on many nights, and carried himself like a guilt-ridden wreck. He returned to the bottle and further deteriorated before ending it all with his gun in 1857. Before he did, however, he left behind a note that also served as a confession. He had indeed killed those 3 people. Somehow, my grandfather had obtained a copy of that note. I'll only write down the more relevant bits. I went to Elizabeth's home on a cold February night, armed with the same gun that I will soon end it all with. Her old man, my father-in-law Obadiah, confronted me as soon as I approached. I shot him in the stomach. He was gut-shot, and while not dead, incapacitated. I walked past his writhing form and I kicked in the door. The ruckus by now had alerted Charles and Elizabeth. Charles tried to draw on me, but I was quicker. He died instantly. He was the lucky one. I caught Elizabeth as she tried to escape, and I bashed her repeatedly with my gun. I definitely cracked a few bones and I knocked out some teeth. During the struggle, an oil lamp was broken and the house caught fire. I didn't fancy getting cooked, so I dragged her outside. I finished her off in front of old Obadiah, who was helpless from his wound. I dragged her corpse to the stream behind the home and I threw it in. I also dragged the mortally wounded Obadiah back to the stream. who swore revenge as I threw him into the stream where he surely drowned. After the blaze died down, I went into the wreckage and I disposed of Charles' charred remains in the same manner. Obadiah wasn't lying about revenge. He torments my dreams damn near every night. I see and hear him in my waking hours. I can't let him get me. I can't let him cook me to death. There's only one way to thwart him. Goodbye. Reading that made me thoroughly hate a man from 6 generations before me. It also made me feel pity for the tormentor for a fleeting moment, until I remembered he had now tortured 5 innocent descendants of this man. He had long ago become that bad guy himself. Revenge is a white whale. Indeed, the fates of my other afflicted ancestors is a saga of tragedy. My great-great-grandfather, just to clarify, he was not a grandchild of Kilgore. Elizabeth was infertile, and so, evil as Kilgore had become, he was not torturing his own biological descendants. Born to my debaucherous great-great-great-grandfather and a prostitute in 1834, begun suffering from the curse almost immediately after his father's death. He moved further east to the big city, believing that he was only cursed in that one part of the country. But it was to no avail, and he threw himself off a tall building in 1874, a few weeks after his 40th birthday. He left no note. And then the curse went to my great-grandfather, born in 1856, who ended it all with his rifle in 1915. My dear grandfather then picked up the curse, who lived to be 77, far older than anyone, save for myself. My mother was an anomaly in that she was targeted while her predecessor was still alive. I had a theory for why that may have happened, but said theory lended verisimilitude to the horrible truth that Kilgore had alluded to when I met my mother in that realm. Accordingly, I paid said theory no need at the time. And she, of course, took her own life in 1942. After my grandfather checked out in 1957, the curse had transferred to me, hopefully the final recipient, and I have filled it for 62 years now. Knowing my family history meant that I was no longer in the dark completely, but otherwise did very little to alleviate my situation. The music still came many nights, and even when music did not, I sometimes suffered random ill effects from the nonlinear dreams and tortures that I had endured. This, for the most part, defined the 1980s for me. Of course, I wasn't idle and passive either. I tried to find ways to defeat my adversary, but with no success. I tried to find out more about the Kilgore family, but I could find nothing save for the fact that those 3 members of the family were murder victims. I consulted various priests, rabbis, and other spiritual advisors. None of them had any real help. Some said a prayer or gave me various blessed charms, but they failed to ward off the curse. I even tried hanging a dream catcher over my bed. That also failed. As a final effort, I started to sleep with a handgun holstered to my hip, in hopes that it would be in the realm with me when I woke up there. I didn't know if earthly weapons could kill those bastards, but it was worth a shot. But unfortunately, I never had it when I spawned there. Over the next few years, I arrived in many of my past forms of myself from long before I started arming myself before bed. Ultimately, despite my best efforts, the 1980s and 1990s were a rather mundane time for me. That is until a life-changing event occurred in 1999. I had fallen asleep despite hearing music that night, and awakened to a much different scene. "Tonight is the night of retribution," Kilgore boomed as I woke up in my cell. Despite panicking at that, I was able to make 2 keen observations. First, I was in my current state for the first time, as opposed to an older or younger form of myself. I knew this primarily because of my second observation. I had my gun with me. I couldn't believe that the gun idea had actually worked. Well, it had partially worked. There is a crucial second part about having a gun with me. As Kilgore approached the door to my cell, I waited for my chance to get a good shot in. He was 10 steps away from the cell door. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. I drew my gun and fired, striking him squarely in the chest. My hopes were brutally dashed, however, when the gunshot wound immediately regenerated. "You really think you're the first one to try to kill me?" Kilgore laughed. "No mortal means can kill me. I'm already dead." Despite my fear, I approached the door so that I was face to face with him. I decided it was time to lay all of my cards on the table. "You're Obadiah, not Charles, right?" I asked. "Indeed," he answered plainly. "Look, what my great-great-great-grandfather did was unforgivable, but I am innocent," I pled. "I long ago regretted making this deal, but there's no way turning back now." Kilgore responded without a hint of emotion. "Guards, let's take him to the death chamber." I nearly collapsed when I heard that. "This isn't right. It's wrong. So wrong," I shouted frantically as the guards approached my cell. "You are one of the lucky ones, you know. You should be grateful." "Lucky?" I shouted back. "Yes." Kilgore continued in a monotone voice. "Every day, all over the world, horrible things befall millions of people who will never know why they are suffering. Did they deserve it? Are they naturally unlucky? Did they anger some deity? They will never know. You have the luxury of knowing why. Because of what a distant ancestor of mine did. That somehow makes all you've done okay." I was hysterical now. "We can talk as we walk," was the response that I got. Kilgore then stepped aside, allowing the guards to remove me from the cell. 155 years I've languished here, waiting for my revenge," Kilgore mused out loud. "If you would have escaped, I would have been doomed to rot here until the end of time. No escape, no contact with my children. If they went to heaven, I won't even know unless I finish you." "Why did you take so long?" I goaded him. "I must capture you in a form within 1 week of your current form. The process abducts at random with no control or precision." "Then why did you take my mother out of order?" I asked angrily. "Your grandfather was clever too. It seems you've learned much as well. I can only exact retribution on the oldest living descendant, which she never was. I was only able to ensure that she had a child." There it was again, an allusion to the great fear I had harbored ever since my encounter with my mother in this realm. "There are rules that I must follow," Kilgore continued. "You needn't know them all, but I am allowed to hone in on younger living descendants with precision, and I can detain them indefinitely, but not for the purpose of detaining until they become eligible for killing. Only the eligible target is afforded protection of the rules." Whatever entity made a deal with Kilgore sure had a foul sense of humor, imposing these rules. At that point, I had accepted my imminent death, and I had to know. Accepting a horrid allegation as fact, I pushed forward for confirmation. "How could you torment your own blood?" I angrily lashed out. "My daughter was infertile. You are not descendants of her. You yourself said you forced my mother to have a child. She vanished for 9 months. I screamed. "Not by my hand. By one of these 2 fine fellows." Kilgore indicated the 2 guards dragging me. I almost vomited, but I held it back. "And here we are," Kilgore said before I could object further. He opened 2 grand oak doors, revealing a small chamber. At the center of the chamber sat an electric chair. This time, I didn't hold my vomit back. Those two guards, one of them, my apparent biological father, strapped me into the chair. I was sobbing now as they shaved my head. This was really it. This was really how I was going to die. Kilgore was smiling ear to ear as the electrode was fastened around my shaven head. The guards had started to prepare the generator when an absolute miracle happened. Suddenly, everything began to shake as I heard the sound of howling wind and a loud crash. "No! No!" Kilgore screamed, enraged and desperate. "Throw the switch quickly!" But it was too late. I jolted awake, crying and sweating in bed. I had been awakened from my sleep in the nick of time by wind knocking an old tree into the side of my house. I cried and I gasped for several minutes before making a terrifying discovery. My head was shaved here in the real world too. That was the last time that I've been to that horrible place. I know that going there again will mean death. I won't get so lucky a second time. I've taken meticulous steps the last 20 years to protect myself, and I spent hours combing through all of my grandfather's notes. Apparently capture within 1 week of your current form means you can be killed, but only your precise form can be kept indefinitely. And since I was awakened, he obviously hadn't gotten my precise form. Also, although the process is random, now that my killable form has been found, I can be taken with precision. Hence why going there again will mean death. Everything has been different since that night. On the nights the music plays, I can feel the seething anger and hatred from the other side, but I can also feel desperation. Kilgore's chances for vengeance are waning and he knows it. From my own observations, I know that the music only plays between 7 p.m. and the crack of dawn. I can't be taken a day. Accordingly, I have adopted a nocturnal lifestyle for the past 20 years, and it has worked well. Until tonight. I'm just so tired tonight. The music played 2 hours ago and there's still close to 10 hours a night. If I were 10 years younger, I could do it. If it were summer and the nights were short, I could do it. But it's winter. So cold, so dark, so old, and so tired. I take some consolation knowing that I'm the last of my line. When I end it all tonight, that will be it. When I die by my own hand, Kilgore will be denied his revenge and will languish for all of eternity. I beat you, you son of a bitch. To whoever finds this, I pray that by the same crazy way, Kilgore doesn't manage to somehow keep the curse alive by placing it on he who finds my body. I highly doubt it, but if so, I'm truly sorry. Goodbye. I'm coming home, Lord. And that end part, folks, is what has so strongly affected me. The curse seems to have been purely familial, and it should be dead now. And yet, I can't get the fear of music out of my head now. Does believing revive the curse? I don't know, but I fear music will forever terrify me now. My nerves have been wrecked by finding this. Any advice would be greatly appreciated.